In trying to explain the period from 1865 to 1900, I often play a game with my students that I'd like to try with you regarding ability to name past presidents. First, I ask them to name as many presidents as they can before 1865. Most are familiar with at least some, if not many of those names. George Washington, father of the country; John Adams; Thomas Jefferson, creator of the Declaration of Independence; James Madison, father of the Constitution; James Monroe, the last of the founding fathers; John Quincy Adams; Andrew Jackson; Martin Van Buren; William Henry Harrison; John Tyler; James K. Polk; Zachary Taylor; Millard Fillmore; Franklin Pierce; James Buchanan; and Abraham Lincoln. Then I ask the students to name as many presidents as they can after 1900, and most are familiar with at least some of those names as well. Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George Bush I, Bill Clinton, the second George Bush, and Barack Obama. But then I ask them, and far fewer know, I ask them to name any of the presidents in the 35-year period between Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt, 1865 to 1900. I get puzzled looks. They are Andrew Johnson, Ulysses Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, Chester Arthur, Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland again, and William McKinley. They don't know, and there's no reason why they should be able to know. These are relative non-entities in the history of the American presidency. But the following non-political figures from that era are very familiar to them: Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the so-called captains of industry to their supporters, or robber barons to their detractors. They are the individuals best known at the time, and they remain the best known today. Now, that fact tells us a great deal about this era and its values. It is the great age of industrialization, and with it, the creation of enormous national wealth as well as personal wealth. The United States, by 1894, is the greatest industrial power in the world. By 1914, its coal and steel output is greater than that of all the European powers put together. The British historian A.J.P. Taylor once quipped that by 1914, the United States was not a rival country economically, but a rival continent. This era, from 1865 to 1900, also witnessed major problems in the United States. Two of these were enormous corruption and an equally enormous and growing gap between rich and poor. As Henry George famously noted in his 1879 book, Progress and Poverty, the expectation that industrialization would make real poverty a thing of the past had not been fulfilled. To the contrary, it had become harder to make a living. The gulf between the employed and the employer is growing wider, George wrote. Social contrasts are becoming sharper. As liveried carriages appear, so do barefooted children. By 1890, 10% of American families owned 73% of the national wealth, while less than half of all industrial workers had an annual income above the poverty line, then from $500 to $600 annually. As a result of having an annual income below that line, their wives and their children had to work at even lower wages just to make ends meet. And today, when people complain about the maldistribution of wealth that exists in the country, They often say it is the worst since this particular time period. Now, both during this time and later, people viewed both the negatives and the positives of this era to be the result of a governmental policy of non-interference in the business world, a hands-off policy that the Scottish economist Adam Smith had most famously proposed in his 1776 classic, The Wealth of Nations. It became popularly known as Laissez-Faire, Laissez-Faire, literally meaning let do, but broadly implying let it be or leave it alone. What was this all about? Smith and other economists had argued against any governmental controls over the economy. And such governmental controls were part of the value structure during the mercantilist era in which he wrote. These controls, such as government-chartered corporations and monopolies, actually hindered economic growth, Smith argued, and the accumulation of wealth. If left alone, the marketplace, according to Smith, would produce more wealth and would be self-regulating by the laws of supply and demand. This invisible hand would allow for constant competition between unfettered individuals and unlimited economic growth and progress. I think it's important to realize that this was revolutionary, liberating thought in 1776, containing the novel idea that wealth was not finite, as was believed at the time, that wealth could actually create more wealth. The old mercantilist idea was that the wealth of the world is finite, and that to get more, you have to take it away from someone else. Smith argued that was not the case, and your wealth did not have to be organized and controlled in any way if you wanted wealth to create wealth. Smith's ideas and those of other economists consequently gained popularity over the next 100 years. And by the late 19th century, they dominated economic thought in the industrialized world. Since then, they have been praised by their supporters for the wealth that they helped to create, and condemned by their opponents for the corruption and the income disparities that accompany them. Now, there is one problem here with everything I've said. The problem is that despite the rhetoric, a hands-off governmental policy towards business did not exist during this era, nor did it exist in any previous era in American history or in any future era in American history. The belief that it did exist in the past is essentially a myth. Rather than laissez-faire, governmental policy at this time was, and previously had been, to intervene in the economy in numerous ways in order to help business. So let's examine how the government did this, first in this particular era, and then previously. Government aid to business in the era of 1865 to 1900 took numerous forms. One was tax policies. This is an era of very high protective tariffs, very high taxes on imports from other countries. The United States has always had a tariff since the first administration under George Washington. But it was a tariff designed to raise revenue in order to run the government. There was no income tax at this point. Government relied upon a low tariff, but one that was constant in order to be able to run. A protective tariff is much higher and has a different aim. It is designed to protect American industries from foreign competition. It also enables American industries to maintain high prices without fear of losing business. By the 1880s, over 4,000 items were covered by tariffs. And in 1890, the McKinley tariff raised the rates on imports to nearly 50% of the price. Some items, such as tin plates, were up to 70%. What did this mean? A woolen blanket or coat that was made in Scotland and that would have cost, let's say, $10 would now cost an American customer $15. That means an American manufacturer who might normally charge $11 is not only protected from cheap foreign competition and a loss of business, but he can actually raise his price to $14 and not lose any customers. And while such protective tariffs reached a high point in the 1890s, the Supreme Court simultaneously ruled that any income tax was unconstitutional, and that remained so until the passage of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution in 1913. Now, another form of government aid to business was land grants to railroads as an incentive for construction of the railroads. Over 180 million acres were granted to the railroads by federal and state governments. That was about 7% of the total U.S. land. There were also loans and financial subsidies to the railroads. Furthermore, numerous businesses successfully lobbied the federal government for additional special favors, and they received them. A third form of government aid was immigration policy. Congress maintained open immigration policies, which provided surplus workers for industry. That helped keep worker salaries very low by the laws of supply and demand. You had an excess supply, so the wages were going to be low. The government also encouraged inventions via patents. And the number of patents exploded after the Civil War. Between 1790 and 1860, the government had granted 36,000 patents total. In 1897 alone, it granted 22,000 patents. By 1910, it had granted a total of 1 million patents, 900,000 of which had been issued since 1870. Inventing itself became a big business, with Thomas Edison developing and patenting not only the light bulb, but hundreds of other items, over 1,000, at his Menlo Park invention factory. Edison also developed the first complete system for electric power generation. Consolidated Edison in New York, better known as Con Ed. And you needed such power generation systems to run many of his inventions. He also founded the General Electric Company, which Eliot Thomson bought in 1892, and which by 1914 was producing 85% of the world's light bulbs. It also contained the first corporate research and development division. Now, the growth of such large-scale corporations was sanctioned and encouraged by the government, even though many such corporations tended to destroy competition. Indeed, the modern corporation could not even exist without some very important court rulings. Let's start with limited liability. A corporation is only liable, the people who buy stock in a corporation are liable only for the money they have invested. That had not been the case earlier in world history. In addition, the courts defined corporations as possessing the same constitutionally guaranteed rights as human beings. That was done during the 1880s. Labor unions, very soon thereafter, are defined as combinations in restraint of trade whose strikes could be halted by court injunctions. Monopolistic corporations were thus ironically protected from state regulation via the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, while labor unions would be prosecuted under the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act designed to outlaw the monopolies. And then, in 1895, the Supreme Court said in the E.C. Knight case that Congress did not have the constitutional power to regulate manufacturing at all, only commerce. As previously noted, the Supreme Court also ruled at this time that the income tax was unconstitutional. Along with all of this came court injunctions against numerous labor strikes and government use of armed force to break strikes. This was frequently done by volunteer state militia, who during this era were reorganized largely for this purpose and became known as the National Guard. Federal troops were also used on occasion, most notably during the railroad strike of 1877 and the Pullman strike of 1894. The railroad strike of 1877 was caused by the four largest railroads agreeing in the midst of a depression to another wage cut. When workers at one of the four struck in protest, President Rutherford B. Hayes sent in federal troops to protect railroad property. That led other railroad workers to strike, and state National Guard troops and police to be called out as well. In Pittsburgh, they opened fire on the strikers and their families, killing 25. That led to even more strikes nationally and more violence. 100 would be killed, and what you had was really the first nationwide work stoppage in U.S. history. The Pullman strike of 1894 will be covered in greater depth in another lecture. The basic facts, which I'll mention now, are that the wage cut during the Depression of 1893 at the Pullman Railroad Sleeping Car Company and its town outside Chicago took place without any cut in the rent charged for workers' housing. That led to a strike and a boycott by the American Railway Union of all trains with Pullman cars. The court issued an injunction against the strike, that it was affecting interstate commerce. When the Illinois governor refused to send in state troops, federal troops were sent in, and the leader of the railway union, Eugene Debs, was arrested, jailed, and both the strike and the union were broken. Now, I would argue that all of this is hardly laissez-faire. Rather, it constitutes active government encouragement of business on its own initiative and at the request of business. And it is not new. There is a long history of government promotion of business. The government had always seen its role as promoting business in order to increase the wealth of the country. That idea had roots in the old mercantilist series of beliefs under which the colonies had originally been founded. Now, under mercantilism, the way to do this was to strive for economic self-sufficiency through creation of an empire and imperial trade regulations and incentives, including special corporate grants, special monopolies. Americans broke out of the British mercantilist system as too confining during the Revolution, and they gradually accepted instead the laissez-faire ideology, at least in theory. But reality is another matter. And the Revolutionary War breakout from the mercantilist system did not mean Americans rejected all mercantilist thought. To the contrary, Hamilton's proposal and Congress's agreement to the first national bank in the 1790s can be seen as a continuation of the mercantilist concept of government-sanctioned and controlled companies, even monopolies. Now, the bank was not a monopoly, but it was a super bank with enormous government reserves and enormous powers to keep other banks in line and direct both the fiscal policy of the country and its economic growth. The same holds true for the Second National Bank in 1816 and the first protective tariff in the same year to protect from British competition. the infant industries that had emerged in the War of 1812. They emerged because during the war, commerce was shut off, and the funds that would have been used for commerce were now available for industrial investment. After the War of 1812, both the state and the federal governments provided financial and other support for the building of canals and roads. Now, not all Americans agreed with such government support for business before the Civil War. The Democratic Party, in particular, under Andrew Jackson, appeared to oppose government favors to any one group, as well as we have previously discussed, any federally funded internal improvements. This could be seen in Jackson's veto of the Maysville Road Bill and his veto of the recharter of the Second National Bank, as well as his ensuing destruction of that bank, as previously discussed. But as previously noted, that destruction was supported by numerous bankers and by Wall Street. It was, in effect, government action in support of other banks, other investors desirous of escaping from the national bank's oversight and control. Furthermore, the Whig Party opposed the Democrats on these points. And the rise of the Republican Party in the northern states during the 1850s created an alliance of all classes in the North who favored government action. Government action not only against slavery, but also against economic competition from slave labor and in favor of free government land for homesteaders, a high protective tariff for northern industry, something for everybody, which was summed up beautifully in the slogan, free soil, free labor, free men. The sectional division of the Democratic Party in 1860, the ensuing Republican electoral victory, and the following secession of the southern states removed the major political barriers to the passage of the entire Republican platform, including high protective tariff, government support for internal improvements, including a transcontinental railroad, and a homestead law. All of these had been previously blocked by the South. This is the only time that a total national party platform is completely implemented. Now, while the reunited Democratic Party after the Civil War claimed to be laissez-faire via its low tariff policy, in reality, it too favored continued government support of business. That was most clearly seen in President Cleveland sending in federal troops to break the Pullman strike of 1894. Now, as we will see later, the reform movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries will want to regulate the perceived excesses of big business, but they will not want to halt government promotion of business. For Americans always have seen promotion of economic growth as a major function of government. Furthermore, some big businesses will in the future actually want this regulation. According to at least one historian, they wanted it as a way to stifle future competition by establishing government rules that large corporations could easily obey, but small newcomers could not without disastrous consequences. And contrary to popular belief, the 1920s did not mark any return to laissez-faire. Indeed, and as we will see, the Republican administrations of those years were quite active in the promotion of business and in the early 1930s in promoting major government programs to end the Great Depression. Myths to the contrary about Herbert Hoover notwithstanding. Business also possesses and uses an ability to obtain the types of government actions it desires and to block those it does not desire via the need of elected government officials to retain business confidence to ensure economic prosperity. And without their economic prosperity, they will not ensure their re-election to office. As we will see in this regard in a future lecture, one reason that the New Deal failed to end the Great Depression was the fact that business would not accept its temporary expedient of deficit spending, as well as a host of other New Deal measures. Ironically, that in turn forced the Roosevelt administration to return to deficit spending. It had dramatically cut deficit spending, but that, without business confidence, led to the recession of 1937. Now, if all of this is true, then where, when, and why did the myth of laissez-faire government policy regarding business develop? Whereas the U.S. government has never been completely laissez-faire, different groups throughout U.S. history have favored sharp restrictions on government's role in the regulation of the economy. Such restrictions have often been proposed and defended in the name of laissez-faire, even though that was a distortion of what was really being proposed and why it was really being proposed. One is reminded in this regard of the use of states' rights arguments by different sections of the country at different times, as discussed in the lecture on the causes of the Civil War. In a similar manner, laissez-faire has been used by different groups at different times to lend ideological support to their self-interests. Does that make such proponents of laissez-faire hypocrites? Critics say yes. But if so, the same can be said for all the different advocates of states' rights whom we have studied. Which raises the fundamental question: is it hypocrisy to honestly believe in something that is not true? Furthermore, if people honestly believed in laissez-faire or states' rights, and if they acted upon such a belief, can one consider such a belief to be a real cause of an ensuing historical event, even if it is not true? I have argued this with some colleagues in other departments. Many would say no. Many historians, though not all of them, would say yes. For human beings create history on the basis not of reality, but their perceptions of reality. Perceptions that are often far removed from what actually occurred. But what actually occurred, as we have seen, and as we will continue to see in this course, is visible only with the hindsight that the study of history provides. In the last lecture, for example, Gettysburg was not perceived at the time in the same way it would later be perceived. The same is true of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and numerous events that we study. It is only with the advantage of historical hindsight that we see what was truly happening and what was truly important.